Thank you so much for being a host today on such a wonderful presentation. And it's my big pleasure to introduce you today's speaker, who is Dr. Sohaib Saeed. And he's a postdoctoral researcher at the Global Quran Project, Freiburg University, where he focuses on a relationship between Arabic exegesis and English translations of the Quran. And he has BA in Tafsir from Al-Azhar University. So we have Azhari today. And his PhD at School of Asian and African Studies, University of London, concerned with the topic of intra-Quranic hermeneutics. Moreover, he is a translator of the great exegesis by Fakhruddin al-Razi, and currently he's working on further translations and original commentaries. The topic of the presentation is Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Quran as a genre. So, Sohaib, you are welcome. The room is yours, waiting for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Mykhaylo. Thank you to Johanna and Majid for organizing this series, and to all of you for your kind attention today. As I talk about a topic which has been central to my PhD research, but today's presentation takes me in a slightly different direction or different angle, as I want to look at Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Quran as a genre, which is something that I've only touched on before now in terms of some of the figures involved in this type of writing. So Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Quran hopefully is not a surprising term to anyone here. It is something which is very familiar, but at the same time, surprisingly underexplored and under-elaborated. We can define it as explaining any part of the Quran with reference to another part. It could be the immediate context or the wider context of the whole corpus. Now, when people are talking about it, sometimes they use the word principle. It's a principle. Sometimes they call it the first principle. Sometimes it's called a method, which implies that there's one way of doing it, whereas in fact, we can find that there are lots of methods involved, and there are different methods, variant methods, conflicting methods, which are involved. Sometimes it's called an approach. I probably use that one more often. And although it's not necessarily put this way, it is perhaps clearer to think of it as a source or the use of a source for exegesis, because it's using the Quran as a source for exegetical insights within the text itself. And today I want to look at how does it look if we think of it as a genre, if we look at works that are written in this regard. Pictured here is my forthcoming book with Edinburgh University Press. This is an artist's impression of it, explaining the Quran through the Quran. And I don't have time to get into this fetching image on the top, but you can see here maybe some conception of how the Quran is seen sometimes as explaining itself or having interconnections between its passages. And these are all things that we will problematize a little as we go through today. Right, so this is a simple kind of overview that I've put together a bit quickly. We'll work on the aesthetics later. But I wanted to give you a historical overview in two things. The theory around TQQ, as I call it, Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Quran, of course, and also the practice of it. Which one precedes the other? Does theory lead to practice? Does practice lead to theory? The chicken or the egg? Is it even a chicken egg? There's a lot of questions which we won't go into here, but I want to look at the two streams, if you like, through the centuries. In terms of people who have spoken about TQQ and expressed some kind of theory of it, you find very little in the early stages. You can find there are some quotes from the early Muslims. Then you can find scattered mentions in works of tafsir. For example, Zamakhshari, al-Razi, these things have been pulled out from their works. I'm sure that they can be found in many others. It's once you get to Ibn Taymiyyah in particular that you have a very express articulation of a theory around Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Quran, but that is only to the extent of one sentence. It is within his broader discussion in his Muqaddimah fi Usul al-Tafsir, which we're going to hear, of course, more about next week. But there were others who talked about Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Quran to small extents, even before Ibn Taymiyyah, but really his statement of it became a significant one, especially in the 20th century. It did find its way and was mentioned by Az-Zarkashi in his al-Burhan fi ulum al-Qur'an. It was then signal boosted much further by as-Suyuti in al-Itqan fi ulum al-Qur'an. Then it was overlooked by Shah Waliullah. He paid no attention to what Ibn Taymiyyah had said, but you can find therein other expressions of Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an. In the 20th century, we have the dominance of the Taymiyyan paradigm about the framework of Tafsir and the sources of Tafsir, in which TQQ is always placed at the top, at least in terms of lip service. And it is declared as a consensus that Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an is the best method or the best approach to interpreting the Qur'an, to the extent that some have said this is the consensus of the Salaf and the Khalaf. Also in the 20th century, you have the emergence of other schools, which we will touch on today. In terms of practice, it is sometimes said that the Prophet himself had used this method, and it is the prophetic method. We can find it represented amongst narrations from the companions. We can find it in early tafsirs, which are still excellent, like Muqatil's. We can find it in the Tafsir of al-Tabari. Again, I'm saying e.g. to say it's not necessarily that there's something special about these works, but I have, consulted them and seen how they use TQQ. There's one attributed to Ibn al-Jawzi, which we don't have. Ibn Kathir we're going to speak about. Al-Biqa'i we're not really going to speak about, but he has, a special link to some of the trends in the 20th century because they see him as a forerunner in that coherence approach. There's one attributed to Al-Amir al-San'ani, also perhaps available in manuscript form. And then we see a proliferation of these works in the 20th century, and that's really where we start to see something we can really call a genre of TQQ. So in terms of general use in works of tafsir, I would categorize TQQ in general works of tafsir as broadly two things. Number one, appeal to immediate context, and number two, citations of verses. Citations which may be verses within the same surah or from anywhere in the Quran. And citations are in turn of two main types: parallels and evidence. So this just helps to boil down a lot of what's going on into a few main things. Appeal to context, typically it's said in modern times, often it's said that earlier mufassirs did not pay attention to context, but of course you can find plenty of attention to context in their own way. In terms of citations, a lot of times it is in the form of saying, well, we have another similar verse elsewhere in the Quran. Ibn Kathir does that a lot, كَمَا قَالَ تَعَالَى, and then he'll just quote another one or two verses which are similar to the one under discussion. So what are some of the reasons why parallels are used? These are some things which I would suggest. First of all, the exegete is trying to support their reading or their interpretation of the particular verse, so they cite the other one just to illustrate that and to support that. They may be clarifying through a more explicit wording or a more expansive wording elsewhere, or through the context of that other verse which they are citing. They may simply be giving a cross-reference for further exploration of the Quran. And I think, to be honest, that's a lot of what Ibn Kathir is doing when he's quoting these things. They may also be giving a cross-reference to their own detailed explanation under another verse. Whether they say that or not, they mean you to go and read that verse and their own commentary under it so that you can better understand what is happening in the present verse. In terms of evidential use, this is lots of things as well. This is the kind of thing that can also be found within usul al-fiqh. What is the relationship between different texts within Quran or between Quran and Sunnah and so on. But that's something that we'll come back to when we see something from al-Shinqiti later on. So I'm going to go through some figures and some individuals who present some kind of landmark in the development of the genre. I won't be including Ibn Kathir in that genre as such, because I don't think he was thinking of himself as doing primarily Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an. So I'll define for you in a minute what I mean by the genre. But this, of course, very famous, significant tafsir, at least now very significant, of course. The history has been discussed numerous times. Oftentimes, as I said, he will start with some parallels. He will discuss lots of hadiths. He will present lots of narrations. He will discuss in depth different aspects of the meaning, debates over the meaning. And in the course of that, he will also use evidentiary citations, as is typical of tafsir works in general. But what's important for us to mention here is that the introduction to his work is itself a reproduction of a large section from Ibn Taymiyyah's Muqaddimah fi Usul al-Tafsir as it came to be known. And he doesn't actually attribute it to his teacher or to anyone. So this quote in particular is something which a lot of my research has kind of revolved around it, as it has an extraordinary amount of presence in subsequent works in Usul al-Tafsir, insofar as those works exist, and also in Ulum al-Qur'an. So he said, if one should ask concerning the best approach, أحسن طرق التفسير, then the answer is that the soundest, and here he uses a different word, asah, is for the Qur'an to be explained using the Qur'an. What is left unclear in one place has been explained in another. That's ijmal and tafsir. And what has been made brief in one place has been expanded in another. If you do not find such, then make recourse to the Sunnah, for it explains and clarifies the Qur'an. So this is repeated a great deal, but examined not so much. There are some issues that arise from these words, and especially if they're taken at face value. First of all, we should note that he has described a limited range of forms. Okay, something is unclear and there's a clearer text elsewhere. Something is brief and there is a more expansive text elsewhere. So that's a kind of illustration of what Tafsir al-Qur'an can include. But what does he think about lots of other ways that TQQ could be realized? Maybe he means that these are the cases which are most explicit and which therefore are the best method. Maybe other things which are less explicit and more open to divergence and more open to doubt and challenge, maybe those are not the best method, but we can't ask him, unfortunately, more about what he meant. Does this quote imply that one can ignore authentic hadiths? You could take it that way, especially because of the way it's structured. Walid Saleh has talked about this, of course, as well, about the Muqaddimah and how this is structured to place Quran at the top. But then the implication is, if you do not find the answer in the Quran, then make recourse to the Sunnah. And it doesn't seem that he would seriously have meant that, especially since the bulk of the Muqaddimah is about actually placing the Sunnah at the top of the tree. And that's why when we have seen people taking on what Walid Saleh has described as the radical hermeneutics of Ibn Taymiyyah, one might imagine that the direction that they could have gone is Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an. But we didn't see the emergence of that genre until, as we say, the 20th century. So what do I mean by the genre? It's not an unproblematic thing to talk about a genre. I appreciate that. I'm being quite loose in my terms here. But I mean a collection of books which are either solely TQQ based, or at least they are primary about that there is some self-understanding, self-description, could be in the title of the book or elsewhere in the introduction, which says that this work will be placing intra-Quranic methods first. This is an approach which has emerged in modernity. The reasons for that, I'm sure, can be elaborated in general discussions about modern tafsir, but we can have some light on it in what I would describe as the potential aims behind creating a work of this specific nature. The first one I put a question mark against because I'm not sure that's how anyone really thought about it. But someone could simply say, well, there are lots of different types of tafsir, but we don't have a work which is focused on Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an, so why not add something different to the Quranic library? I imagine that al-Shinqiti, for example, might have thought that way, but again, I haven't seen any proof of that was the self-conception. There is this modern emphasis on coherence, on consistency, and this just fits within the general trends of meeting some of the challenges of modernity and the perceptions and perspectives on scripture which accompanied that. There are also some who have gone this direction because of hadith skepticism on their part, or outright rejection of hadith and sunnah as we will see with my reference later on to Quranist works. There are also those who have used Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an as a banner or a mantle of authority in order to advance their own intellectual project. So using the kind of authority and objectivity implied by TQQ to put across the ideas that they want to put across. And I'll talk about examples of that as well. So let's start this exploration of the genre by Thana'ullah Amritsari. So his book, published in 1902, Tafsir al-Qur'an bi Kalam al-Raḥmān. We've got a very explicit intention there in the title. This is a concise work. It comes in one volume, inline style. It is concise. And in the introductions, and this is the edition which was published later on in Saudi Arabia, the work had gone through some stages of controversy and revision. And so this edition reflects some of the things that were corrected. But that was not to do with the basic approach of Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an. In the introductions, we can see a note from Shibli Nomani, who noted that there were no works before this one, to his knowledge, which engaged in Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an to this extent. And in his own introductory sections, Thana'ullah Amritsari includes the critical notes by Shah Waliullah on Asbab al-Nuzul. Right? So I won't go into all these points here, but it's just to show something of the intellectual lineage and to show that one of the concerns around the need for Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an is that much of tafsir involves an over-reliance on this type of literature, on these type of narrations, which are sometimes unreliable or sometimes taken too much at face value when a more critical approach is required. I'm going to be very brief about everybody because we want to get through these quickly enough, but hopefully there'll be a chance to engage in some questions about anything that catches your eye. So next, I'm going to mention Muhammad al-Amin al-Shinqiti. His book, Adwa al-Bayan, again, fi idah al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an, is explicit in that regard. His work is maybe the most famous of this genre in the modern times. But what's interesting, and I think a lot of people don't realize about it, is that it's not a full tafsir in the sense that he doesn't discuss every verse. So for example, the case study surah, which I treated in my thesis, Al-An'am, he talks about 49 of the verses out of 165. He does often draw from Ibn Kathir, not necessarily uncritical of some of the things that Ibn Kathir mentions, but there is a little bit of a lineage in that regard. And it should be known that from 59 onwards, from Al-Hashr onwards, is not his work. Now, in his introduction, Shinqiti notes the consensus, as I said before, that TQQ is the best method. He also says, and this is not an unusual statement by any means, he says, because none better knows the meaning of the book of God than God himself. So this is the trope which we find recurring in such works, which seems to suggest that when you do Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an, in fact, it is God who is doing the tafsir. That by going to the other verse, we are finding God's own explanation of his book. And sometimes this is expressed in a slightly different way, that the Qur'an explains itself. Now, it shouldn't need to be said, but sometimes it goes unsaid, that it is actually the exegete, the reader, who is doing the interpreting, who is doing the explaining. And some writers, of course, have pointed this out before. But you can see perhaps the confusion that can arise from talking in these kind of loose terms. None better knows the meaning of the book of God than God, while uncontroversial as a statement, does not mean that Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an is tafsir by God. He himself, Shinqiti himself, does tarjih, that is to say, he selects his preferred view, using the Sunnah and using other factors. He also accepts that multiple interpretations are correct if they are equally attested by the Qur'an. That's in contrast with others like Farahi, who I will mention. al-Shinqiti has quite a detailed introduction. We won't go through all this, but I just want you to see the kind of details that are there. He's describing the types of intra-Quranic bayan. And it seems to me that what he's done is, after completing his work, or completing what he completed, he compiled an account of how the verses are relating to each other. And that's a very useful starting point for a methodological exploration of types of tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an and types of relationship between verses in the Qur'an. Next, we'll move to the structural coherence school. So famously, we have Hamiduddin Farahi, who is the founder of the school, as it were, and his book Nizam al-Qur'an wa Ta'wil al-Furqan bil-Furqan. So we've got two things here. On the one hand, the importance of his structural coherence method, and with it, interpreting the criterion by the criterion, right? And it's a work which is only spanning a few surahs. Unfortunately, it's incomplete. But he has another work which is pictured here, Ta'liqat fi Tafsir al-Qur'an al-Karim. It's been compiled from some notes that he left behind. It spans the entire Qur'an, and it's a useful way of trying to get some sense of what he wanted to say about other verses that he didn't get around to explaining in full. We have his student, Ahsan Islahi, has got a full commentary which is built upon the method of his teacher. It's in Urdu, Tadabbur al-Quran. And there are contemporary writers also who continue to develop this approach in somewhat divergent ways. This is just something, again, you can perhaps review in the recording if you like, which is Farahi's argument for the definitive nature of the Quranic text. So he's pushing back against what he sees as mistaken approaches of commentators who went before. The text itself, the Quranic text, is qat'i, it's definitive, whereas external evidences, which includes hadith, are not definitive in the same way. He also believes that a passage of the Quran can only have one correct interpretation, and that is to be derived through the study of the nizam, or the structure. Next, we will talk about Muhammad Hussein al-Tabatabai. And unfortunately, I don't have a hard copy of his tafsir, that's why I've used the stock image. His work, Al-Mizan fi Tafsir al-Qur'an, an extremely detailed work, not from the title, but from the introduction and from some of his additional writings around his hermeneutical method, we understand that he has given priority to Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an. There are sections within this work which he calls Bayan versus Riwa'i sections, and the former sections contain frequent citations of the Qur'an. And this work also has rich thematic asides in which he gathers verses from across the corpus around specific issues which come up as he goes through the text. His description of his approach is based on tadabbur, which is reflection, and what he calls istintaq al-Qur'an, which I find a fascinating expression. It would be almost asking the Qur'an or having it speak. Does that imply that once the Qur'an speaks, it is speaking from itself? Does this imply objectivity? Does it imply transcending the problems of subjectivity and interpretation? Certainly it implies those things, but that deserves further discussion. What's interesting also is that he repurposes the dichotomy between Tafsir bil-Ma'thur and Tafsir bil-Ra'i, which has been thoroughly panned by Professor Walid Salih, among others. He changes it to serve this purpose of emphasizing Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an. First of all, he says that the tafsir which we have from the Prophet and from the Imams was mostly or entirely TQQ. As such, this approach is itself Ma'thur, right, is the oldest inherited approach. What he also does is he defines Tafsir bil-Ra'i, which has this negative connotation, as you know, to encompass everything that departs from the Zahir, the apparent sense of the Quran, by drawing on external sources. So he turns Tafsir bil-Ma'thur into specifically Tafsir of the Quran through the Quran. Another important thinker is Aisha Abdurrahman, who's known as Bint al-Shāti. Her work is partial. She has written commentaries on 14 short surahs of the Quran. And this work is the development of the literary school of Egypt, al-Madrasa al-Adabiyya, and her work is called Tafsir al-Bayani lil-Qur'an al-Karim. So it would be quite important in exploring her ideas to look into the sense in which they intend adabiyya and also bayaniya, and what are these terms indicating about the literary study of the Quran. But one of the central things that she does emphasize is studying the text holistically and internally. Like others before her, and I didn't quote all of them saying it, but they very typically are saying in the modern times that Mufassirun before us did not focus on the tafsir, the fact that the Quran explains itself. They did not do justice to this. They also said that they were reading, and Bint al-Shāti says that they were reading atomistically. That's how I'm translating it anyway. And this is the term that you find coming up from thinkers like Fazl al-Raḥmān and then Mustansir Mir. Again, it's a framing in which the earlier exegetes have to be described as doing things in a certain way in order to demonstrate the value of doing things in a different way in the current time. So again, I'm not going to go through all of this, but a few key terms that come up in her work. She talks, instead of istintaq al-Qur'an, she talks about al-ihtikam ila al-Qur'an. So going to the Quran for adjudication between various possibilities. So if a word could have several different meanings, we turn to the Quran to be the hakam, to be the judge between these various possibilities. She talks about gathering verses from across the Quran, at-tanawul al-mawdu'i. She talks about istiqra, which I take to mean a comprehensive survey of relevant verses. So we're nearing the end of the list of people who fit within the genre. I'm going to discuss a few that may or may not fit within the genre or have some difference between, maybe a more substantive difference from the others that have preceded. So we have works within the category of what's called Quranism, or Quran alone, or Quran only, etc., etc. Some of the more substantial ones are those by Ghulam Ahmed Parvez. Rashad Khalifa is perhaps not substantial. Edip Yüksel, perhaps, if we include the footnotes that he's included along with his commentary, is among the more substantial. What's interesting about this this particular group, now, if we understand that the mainstream approach has always accepted that the Quran is a source for tafsir. Remember, we said at the beginning, TQQ is a source. So it's been accepted that the Quran is a source, and an important source, and maybe the best source. And then we have got those who say it is the only source for tafsir. And that's not quite what is being said by those before, even those who are demonstrating some skepticism towards hadith, some concerns about overuse of hadith. They are not saying that one cannot appeal to hadiths at all. Whereas this group, and they're not, of course, just one group, but this group of thinkers take a more radical approach to the question of Quranic authority versus the authority of external sources for its interpretation. So they would say only use the Quran itself and use reason. So among the kind of doctrines that they advance is that the Quran is clear and that there is no clergy in Islam, and as such, nobody has the right to advance their interpretation as authoritative. So this anti-tafsir attitude in a way puts them in a bind when it comes to writing tafsirs, right? So they still write them sometimes and they still promote them, but it is paradoxical that in a way they're saying the Quran itself is enough, but then still writing works that we are supposed to read alongside the Quran. Another interesting phenomenon that we find in these works is that often passages in the Quran are read as if they are about the rejection of hadith. So passages which are typically understood as being a dialectic with the Jews and Christians or with the mushrikun of Mecca are now repurposed as condemnation of the followers of hadith, which is kind of an obviously anachronistic approach to reading it. We can also find examples where TQQ is opposed, such as Yüksel, who reads in Al-Isra verse 46, إِذَا ذَكَرْتَ رَبَّكَ فِي الْقُرْآنِ وَحْدَهُ. He reads this as in the Quran alone, because that fits, you know, it becomes a proof text for his doctrine. But there's an obvious parallel which should be kept in mind in Surah Al-Zumar verse 45, إِذَا ذُكِرَ اللَّهُ وَحْدَهُ, because the first text can be understood in both ways. When you remember your Lord alone in the Quran, or when you remember your Lord in the Quran alone. I'm going to talk about two separate things, reflections and readings, but I'm just putting them together here to indicate things which also may not fit within TQQ proper. But I'm leaving that as an open question. You know, what are the boundaries of a genre? I'm not going to try and dictate that to, you know, especially at this point when we are not used to talking about TQQ as a genre. So an example of reflections on the Quran which are framed this way is this very recent work, which is titled Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an. Originally, and I have the book here, we had Tafsir Surah Al-An'am, which is touted as the first in a series, Silsilatu Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an. So that was the intention of the author, and then after his death, they have gathered some of his writings into this volume, which I haven't had a chance to see yet. However, I know that it incorporates the An'am commentary. In his introduction, you find a very sweeping dismissal of tafsir. You know, it's full of Israeliyat, this kind of trope which you find amongst modernist thinkers. Interestingly, he claims that most prophetic exegesis was TQQ. We've seen that also before with Tabatabai. This does not stand up once we actually look at the hadiths. We find a very small number of hadiths which are actually relevant to tafsir that can be seen to be TQQ. He also ignores earlier works in the genre, as people also tend to do, and say, well, nobody has ever touched on this before me. In his book, he has these passage-based discussions with tangents of dubious relevance. So for example, under the verse 82 of Al-An'am, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَلَمْ يَلْبِسُوا إِيمَانَهُم بِظُلْمٍ, a very famous verse, the locus of a lot of discussion around what does it mean to have wrongdoing pertinent to faith. What is dhulm in the context of Iman? And it's also a case which is perhaps the most famous example of Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an done by the Prophet, but I won't go into that. Al-Alwani, instead of discussing those things, he has several pages discussion about dhulm in society and amn in society, you know, security on the social level, etc., which it's very hard to see as being related to the verse at all. In terms of readings of the Quran, something which, in terms of how I've categorized things in the way I've thought about it in my thesis, is we have something called thematic exegesis. That's a term which is used quite widely nowadays, Tafsir al-Mawdu'i. And I see that as two things. One is what I call surveys, and that is reading through the Quran for a certain topic, aiming at an objective summary of how the Quran treats that subject, right? Aiming at objectivity, of course. And then you have explicitly purpose-oriented readings. And Hassan Hanafi has talked about this. Reading the Quran with a particular purpose in mind is another type of thematic exegesis. Aisha Hidayatullah, talking about this, describes TQQ as a keystone feminist exegetical strategy. So an example of a work which treats this, again in the introduction, is Asma Barlas, Believing Women in Islam. This is an image of the revised edition in 2019. A question that would arise here is, to what extent is it framed and thought of by the author as tafsir? So although we're describing as exegesis, the author herself is very dismissive of tafsir in the past, and mostly is describing what she's doing as a liberatory reading, and as you can see on the cover also, unreading of patriarchal interpretations. So what is the relationship between tafsir and readings? That needs to be explored. We find that she appeals to Ibn Kathir, and she cites an article of Mykhaylo as describing that Ibn Kathir believed in Tafsir al-Qur'an, but we don't see much engagement with other sources in which this method has been explored. And she appears also to recur and Western hermeneutical methods. She cites Mustansir Mir at some points, talking again about coherence, the coherence approach, but she does not seem to explore the work which Mir himself was pushing forward as this great example of coherence in the modern age, which is Amin Ahsan Islahi, whom we saw already. What were the results of his reading, his coherence reading of the Quran? And does that, to any extent, unread some of the patriarchal interpretations? So these are open questions which I'll leave to greater minds. But here in the conclusion, I just want to say something about what is the value of this genre, insofar as it is a genre. What does it add to tafsir, given that we have got so many works? How important is it for us to pay attention to it, to read it? Shinqiti's Adwa al-Bayan is an interesting case because more than anyone else, he just neglects to present a method or to explain the importance of what he's doing. Right? He says it's the best method, but he doesn't then say what the method is that he's going to follow. He describes after the fact the type of interrelations in the Quran. Whereas someone like Farahi and those who followed him are saying that there needs to be a shake-up of the approaches to tafsir. So the way I see Adwa al-Bayan is that it's a thematic resource, and we can appreciate works like this in that way. So just like as-Suyuti's Ad-Durr al-Manthur, which in my view was intended not as a complete exegesis, given that Suyuti has got several other exegetical works, but if we think of what Suyuti was doing as gathering hadiths and narrations pertinent to tafsir in one place so that it can be the basis for further methodical and rigorous study of the Quranic verses. Then the same thing could be said of Shinqiti's work and others in the TQQ genre, that what they've done is demonstrate relevant verses and how they're relevant, and then that could be part of a more detailed examination of the Quranic verses. What we can see about this genre is mostly it reproduces the same diversity of opinions that are found throughout tafsir. So for example, if we were to compare Tabataba'i's work from a Shi'i perspective with various others from a Sunni perspective, we'll find that Tabataba'i supports the same opinions that Shi'i authors tend to support. The Sunnis support the same view that Sunnis tend to support, only that they're doing it through the method of Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an. It doesn't lead them to different conclusions or to changing their theological perspectives or positions. Therefore, when people are suggesting that this is going to solve the problem of subjectivity in tafsir and lead to an objective truth of what God meant in the Quran, this has to face the challenge of practical real life. So finally, I will simply say that it requires more detailed methodology. This is why I've done my thesis work, is why I'm writing this book, to show the nature of the methodology involved, how it exists alongside other approaches. And with that, I'll stop, and thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much. And that's a very interesting point going all together with this. And I'm more than sure that everyone got really impressed by this presentation, since we have a really a working paradigm here. And the presentation was also interesting from the side that you are working currently on the writing of this book. And this is like a story from your own experience of working with the Quran and being at once a scholar in some way and a mufassir here. Of course, this is quite a hard discussion, but thank you so much once again. And I have just a few thoughts to address as a host before we go into Q&A section, that I completely agree for many issues that we see that Tafsir al-Qur'an, the expression is used by representatives of so many various intellectual trends in contemporary Islamic thought. Yeah, we have some good experience from the Salafis, like Shinqiti's Tafsir, the same for Shia and mainly when browsing contemporary books published in Iran on Quranic exegesis, there are a lot of things published on the Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Quran. First of all, starting from discussing al-Mizan, but at-Tabatabai. But what was interesting for me also is your opinion on Tafsir al-Qur'an by the book by al-Alwani. Yes, so I have this book now, the whole Tafsir, and he says that Tafsir al-Qur'an for him, it's just a tadabbur, ta'ammul, tafakkur, and taqul. So it's completely really different methodology. So we see under the name of Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Quran, so many approaches are used, and in some way it could be something closer to Tafsir al-Mawdu'i, but from another point, we see that it's another kind of method approaching verses from the Quran. So if for Alwani we have some thoughts or impressions or browsing the Quran from some kind of ideological perspective, so we see a more traditional, let it be said, more traditional approach in some other tafsirs. I have also a question on the issue of qira'at. There is a study, Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an, Ta'assul wa Taqweem by Muhsin al-Mutayri, published almost 10 years ago in Saudi Arabia from King Saud University. And he dedicated one of the chapter of his studies to the issue of qira'at. So that they are explaining Quran from a perspective of Qira'at al-Shadza and comparing to Qira'at al-Mutawattira. There's also a kind of Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Quran. Of course, that sometimes there are a lot of questions of how we can explain some single words from the Quran, just use it once like as-Samad or Sibghat, just 2 times Sibghatullah, yeah. So how we can explain this word, but there is also how we can really turn to the meaning of Malik or Maliki or many other cases of Qira'at. For the lack of time, I will not go into any details of this question, but what's your idea on that? Are there any relation between the Qira'at issue and Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Quran? Just browsing also on the perspective of your studies about on the Hafs normativity of the Quranic text, its usage for the translation. So what do you think on that? Can we use this issue of Qira'at for relating it to the Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Quran?
Sure. Thank you so much, Mykhaylo, for your remarks and for your excellent question. It is, so I looked at all types of works which touch on usul al-Tafsir to see what they are including, what they feel that TQQ is. And yes, in more recent times, some writers have included Tafsir via the Qira'at as one of the forms of Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Quran. That is to say, using certain readings to explain other readings. So you can find that, for example, in the book Tafsir wal-Mufassirun by Muhammad Hussein al-Dhahabi. What's interesting is in some of these works, they give examples using the Qira'at Shadha, al-Qira'at al-Shadha, or the non-canonical readings, as I would prefer to call them here, right? So it's hard to understand what they would mean by using non-canonical readings, which are considered not Quran, to explain things that are Quran. Now, they can be used, but the question is, how is that Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Quran? So others have then opined that no, they should actually restrict that TQQ discussion to explanation using canonical readings amongst themselves. In my personal view, this would not be still a form of Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Quran. Yes, I think that readings can be explained in light of each other. But I think that the scope of Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Quran is really once you have established what the verse is and how it is being perceived and vocalized and read, then it is compared with things in its context and it is compared with other verses in the Quran. Also, one of the ways in which specific readings are explained individually and with respect to each other is through TQQ. So the tawjih or the ihtijaj for a particular reading, that is to say, the argument that this reading is sound or that this reading is superior, as they used to say in the olden days, is based on well, this is how it's read throughout the Quran, or this is how it's read in these other verses. So there's definitely a relationship between the two things, but I personally would not class explanation of the qira'at amongst themselves as a form of tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. That's really impressive point, and probably also an issue for many other investigations. Okay,